You got it?
I got it.
Okay. So my name is Mark Narcus Kramer, and I got involved in Flexus because I was good friends with Lisa Kimball. But I didn't grow up at all with this organizational development focus or complexity theory, but she'd have all these really interesting things, so I'd come to a Plexus meeting. But something's really stimulated me in the last 6 months. First of all, I just retired. And the more I started reading about complexity and having time, I realized that it fit some of the things that I naturally experienced. So I started writing a book about my management experience here. I came from a company called the MITRE Corporation, a system engineering company filled with the most brilliant mathematicians and engineers and scientists. And when I first joined there, it was the most hierarchical thing you could imagine. You know, I mean, first of all, there was hardly any diversity. You know, maybe 3 women were on the staff, and it looked at every problem only through an engineering's eye. And after many years, it became quite evident that we weren't accomplishing anything. We were getting a lot of research money to do studies and jobs, but we'd always come up with these great ideas and they would go nowhere. And we had the typical engineering reaction to that, which is, well, they're just so stupid, they can't see it, you know, they can't see it. And we got involved in a very large project for the Federal Aviation Administration called the Advanced Automation System. And after $2.5 billion, the thing completely flopped. And finally, Congress came to our company and said, gee, we give you this money every year as a research organization because we could get money from Congress to make things get better. Nothing's happening. I think we're going to just cut you completely free. And we were saved by a associate administrator who said, I'm going to help change them. But meantime, we had a new president come in, and the new president saw things in a very different light. He saw things in a holistic light. So we developed something called outcome management. And outcome management shifted the focus from being great engineers to understanding where we wanted the system to go, and then understanding what all the factors associated with making that system happen. So you could have a great engineering idea, but if the economics wasn't working, no good. Or if you had a great idea, but the money and the politics wasn't there, or the airlines weren't there, or, you know. And then we realized there were just enormous number of stakeholders. Avionics manufacturers, airlines, FAA, Congress. And we began to realize that in order to achieve outcomes, we couldn't manage in this top-down way. So we started developing processes, which I call network type of management structures, where people were paired with different stakeholders, and people had different responsibilities. So then I got involved in a project called the Capstone Project, which Alaska had the accident rate of 5 times. And for years and years, they kept talking about, we got to fix this, we got to fix this. And finally, Senator Stevens' wife died, and he got totally frustrated. And he developed a program called the Capstone Program, which was supposed to solve this problem. And we got involved in it. And in doing that, I was leading that project. And instinctively, without knowing it, I actually followed a lot of the principles of complexity theory. I got stakeholders involved. I had meetings in which I had secretaries there. I had everybody involved in it. I didn't have the managers speak and tell everybody what to do. And I found this to be remarkable. And, you know, examples of situations where somebody was saying to me, you know, I'm stuck on this side project here, but I would be much better up in Alaska doing the X. And people began to self-organize, and people began to communicate in ways that we had never seen before. So, you know, somebody would just come to my office and he'd raise his eyebrow and I said, what's wrong? And he'd tell me something. And 2 days later, we were actually changing the nature of the project because he had had some insight that nobody had seen. And so I began to see this whole way of operating. And I helped develop something called outcome management, which said, if we want to achieve something, we can't look at the problem just from an engineering standpoint. And we can't just look at it from aviation. We have to say, what happens to the environment? What happens to people's sense of privacy? What happens to their security? What happens to, and so we raised this, which then created a situation where we had to have lots of people looking at different things. So we had to develop from a very highly technical engineering perspective to bringing in people who are operations oriented, to economists, et cetera. So as our company evolved, we actually moved to this way of managing, and we became much more effective and well respected. And so when I retired from the company, I said, gee, I'd like to write about these experiences. And then I started looking at complexity theory, and I'm saying, my God, this is happening all over the place. And I asked myself two questions, and this is what I want to discuss at this meeting. The two questions are, gee, I know Plexus and Plexus Associates, people have been involved in these kind of experiences, like stories. You know, I have my story about how this was successful. But I read in academic literature and all that certain results, but I haven't seen Plexus people put together a compendium of stories that say, hey, when you apply these principles, we often get really positive results. And why do we get positive results? So that was the first question I asked. It's just, wouldn't it be great if Plexus put a book out that basically said, hey, here's our experience with these things, and look how they actually work. Then the second question I asked myself, and this is maybe will be part of the book or maybe just a research activity or something we can all think about. I see most of these things when they're applied, I see them applied to very local situations like a hospital or some schools in South Africa or a project. What about the big problems like global warming, about income inequality, the problems associated with automation and income inequality and racism? I mean, do we know how to scale up these principles to deal at that kind of level? And that intrigues me because I get encouraged when I see the very local, so many local stories are working, but I don't necessarily see how they're translating into solving some of our really fundamental problems. So I wanted to extend, after we go through these examples, I wanted to extend that to a larger question. And if we had some good thoughts or ideas, it would go in the book, or else the book could just end as examples. So that's my catalytic project that I'm trying to get off the ground. And I'm looking for people to work with me. Now, the way I'm thinking of people working with me is either they could write a chapter on something that they experienced like I experienced, or like a Mercer project or something that they know these principles worked. Or I can interview people, or get a bunch of us to interview people, and we could actually do the writing and send it off. So that's where I'd like to take this project. And what I want to do for the rest of the hour, because I don't really have an enormous amount more to talk about, except I could talk about my first chapter some more, but I'm not sure that's what I want to do. I want to bring it out to you people to see, if you think this is a reasonable idea, and secondly, if you're interested. So I'm going to open the floor up. First of all, what I'd like to hear from you all is experiences you've had with complexity theory and outcome management. Let me tell you where I think there's a little bit of a difference, but maybe they're the same thing. When I say outcome management, my concept is that we all have to be, whatever field we're working in. If I'm working on the engineering side, I can't just focus on the engineering problem. I have to feel as if I'm invested in this, in the outcome. You know, if my outcome is to save lives in Alaska, then I'm invested and everybody in the project's invested. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to do the work of the economics or the aviation development, but I have to be asking the questions of the team. Do we have people working on this? Do we have involvement in this? Can we find partners? And I don't think that's just the upper management that does it. I think I would like everybody on the team to be asking those questions. And because I don't think it's, you know, I don't think we can continue to operate on solving problems in the stovepipe manner. One of the last problems I worked on, for example, was can we get drones to deliver packages? And it seemed like a really difficult technical problem, but they were making a lot of progress on the technology, you know. But when you start asking the broader questions about, well, what does it feel like to have 1 million drones over your city? Can you assure that those drones are not going to be spying on people? Can you assure that they're not going to be hostile? What happens if the system breaks? What happens to the drivers of trucks that you've now displaced? These don't turn out to be engineering problems, but in the last paper I wrote in my professional career, I said, if you don't solve those problems, you know, we're going to be just banging our head against the wall on a technology that might actually work, but nobody wants it, or if it gets put out there, it's going to have so many serious consequences. I asked that question about computer security. I said, I can't believe that when people had an open computer, that somebody or some group of people wasn't really worried about what's going to happen. But apparently it sort of was neglected, and now we're living in a world of cyber problems. So part of the idea of outcome management is to try to understand the complexity of the whole system rather than just pieces of it. So I'm going to open it up. What I'd like each of you to do, if you can, is to tell me a little about yourself and what stories you have about your own experience with complex systems, and if you have any positive experiences that could actually be written up. So I'll open the floor. Abby, do you have anything?
Mark, can you come back to me? Because I'm still thinking.
Okay. Bill, do you have any stories to tell?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is you're really not that far behind, Mark, when it comes to thinking about leadership and outcomes and things like that. If you look at leadership science, essentially there's no science in leadership science, and it's something that's recognized and struggled within, and is a struggle within the field. And they're trying to come up with a way of coming up with a more of an empirical approach to outcomes and science in leadership, but they've not been able to do that. And so what they've essentially done is just, you have someone who has a success, and then whatever process they had that seemed to be related to that success, then they published on that. But you can't translate that process to another setting. They're not, you know, they're just not transferable. So the question is it really science or is it not science? And I think that your approach could provide a basis to a leadership science that just doesn't exist at this point. How I might be able to help you.
1 second, my wife is.
Sorry?
You're interfering with the conversation. Thank you. My wife had a phone call and I didn't. Okay, go on.
That's okay. So 2 years ago, I gave a presentation at the Robert H. Smith School of Business on complexity in business, on commonalities between Lean Sigma and the hierarchical organization of the brain, and how both might benefit from a more nonlinear, how Lean Sigma might benefit from a more nonlinear kind of approach, and model it how the brain processes information, how it takes in and filters data and works to make sense of it and come up with conclusions. So it would not be an outcome like you were asking for, but I could contribute something on possibilities of reimagining Lean Sigma from a nonlinear and complexity viewpoint.
Well, Bill, one of the things I think is exciting about what you said is maybe we start with the stories rather than saying, well, we have a set of principles, like scientific principles, and here are the stories that validate them. Maybe we start with the stories, and then we examine the stories to understand what may be common between what I experienced in Alaska, what somebody else did with healthcare, what somebody did with that. And then we could maybe wrap it up with, how do we biologically deal with information? And so we could link the two. That sounds exciting to me. But I think the idea I'm getting, I start out with saying, gee, what are the complexity principles? And let me have my stories confirm them. And I'm beginning to think what you said is maybe we don't have a science so clear that says, well, we can illustrate the principles. Why don't we start out with things that worked, that had many of the qualities of complexity, and then try to summarize at the end, here are the things that seem to work. So that's what I got from your talk. Yes, Denise.
I'm going to unmute myself. The interesting thing about what both of you are saying, and this is really exciting, is because you being able to link back into either a model or a management style that has wide visibility. So Lean Six Sigma, I'm really familiar with it. It's constantly, sort of moving here and trying to break out, because there are people who are saying this isn't quite working the way it is, which is why the Agile movement came in, and still then everybody wants to push it back into something that can be quantifiable and predictive, et cetera, et cetera. And being able to have what are those nonlinear approaches that could apply to anything. Lean Six Sigma is what you mentioned, Bill. I think it's great. Everyone understands it clearly from outcome management. Lean Six Sigma is one of the things that people hang their hats on. And from your perspective, Mark, it's what you're doing is, if not necessarily providing a really specific step-by-step, because it doesn't need to be step-by-step approach of here's how you achieve this. What it's doing is asking questions, and it's saying, how can working with a Lean Six Sigma or working with the models that you had at the MITRE Corporation, are we able to create something that could be more effective? And one of the things that I wrote in here was that the outcomes can be negative and they can be messy, but what has been learned and the new options that emerged from it are really what the value is. So after the $2 billion that everybody spent, something really positive came out of that by being forced into the Capstone project.
Yes, it actually did.
So it's not always positive, but it is specifically a different way in which you operate. And you're absolutely right, Bill. I'm sitting here writing, wow, if we really had a leadership science, but that leadership science is about as complex as anything because there's so many different components that are linked into it. So, but thank you. I think this is great. Anyway, if I'm making sense, I'm very excited. Yay.
Yay. Okay. Prusha. Unmask. You're muted. There you go.
Okay. Mainly the things that I had been involved with were as an observer and a writer. So the healthcare things obviously were fabulous and very successful. And the other thing that occurred to me, I did a blog for several years, and I tried to find examples of complexity in news and current events. And I think that's something that we could do as well. It's not something that we've done, but something that we can illustrate, and that might be maybe a separate chapter.
I like that idea. Hey, John, do you have?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I'm late. I missed the first bit of your introduction. But I'm a retired physician, and I've joined this group really because you speak a language which is from a different planet from my area, which is really in the area of continuing medical education and continuing education. And the whole science, if you want to call it that, of complexity has been, there have been a number of articles written which hasn't really impacted at all on the continuing education community, or very little. It's been written in a language that's not familiar to the people who should be reading it, so it's not been read. But something has happened recently, which I think creates an opportunity for us to link the two domains together. And that is a number of evaluative reports over a period of 10 years, starting from the Institute of Medicine reports, have told us that continuing education, especially in the healthcare system, is limited to knowledge acquisition. And the steps that are required to go from knowledge acquisition to actually impact on practice and patient outcome is a journey which involves social processes and actually talking to each other, and which is really, when you come to think of it, seeing us as agents in a complex adaptive system. And to actually start to think of how this can be introduced into continuing education is a challenge that we have. And I'm sort of semi-retired, so I feel I can start to look at some of the high-hanging fruit in problems. And I think this certainly is one of them. The evaluative studies have suggested, for instance, that this continuing education needs to stop thinking of one-off single-hour presentations where an expert is speaking very loudly to the audience and thinking that that's going to have the impact, and to move on to what has been called sequential programming. So you bring people back, but they don't understand the reason for this. My colleagues don't, because they're not familiar with complexity science, don't understand that what you're actually trying to do when you build sequential programs is create the relationships that are required to produce generative interactions. And they don't understand what a generative interactions are. Etienne Wenger and myself observed physicians around a committee meeting, and Etienne said to me after, he says, "My God, John, they're just barking at each other like dogs in the night, and they're not listening to each other. So because they're intent on reloading for their next shot." And I think that the whole concept of a structured dialogue, which leads to which is the basic of generative interactivity, is quite foreign to the CME community. So there are a number of things we're right at the point now whereby I feel if they could understand a little bit more about complexity science and about complex adaptive systems, I think it would take them out of this quagmire they're in now, as to how to move from knowledge acquisition to actually behavior change. I'm going to just stop there.
John, I have just one question for you. Has there been any examples of where people have moved in this direction that you know of, that you could cite as something that looks like it's working? Or
yes, I work with an educator in Montevideo And he and his colleagues, they actually produce online systems and face-to-face programs for over 1 million physicians in South America. And they produce the programs for them. And Alvaro has he and I have written quite a bit about this. And he said, well, one of the things when we try to get physicians to talk to each other in programs, one of the things that we notice is if they know each other before, the dialogue is successful. And in fact, what he is trying to do now is develop software to identify. So instead of broadcasting a program and hoping people come to it, and they sit beside each other and they don't know each other, the relationship capital is zero. He's trying to now develop software to invite specific people with similar practices, and he's trying to understand what is necessary in those similar practices that creates the right context for a generative dialogue. And I've pointed out to him, and I mentioned this at the call on Tuesday, that I spend quite a lot of time observing physicians in the doctor's lounge in large hospitals. And they come together at 10 o'clock and they group themselves into little groups and have coffee. And the dialogue quite often starts with, gee, let me tell you about this patient I had last night. And in fact, if you listen to that dialogue very carefully, it has a structure to it. And someone will eventually come up and say, well, whenever I see this, I do such and such, which is, as I mentioned on Tuesday, what we call positive deviance. And there is a orchestration to this dialogue, which I think some of it could be and it's really around the whole area of complex adaptive system when you think of it very carefully. And I think some of these areas could be actually adopted into more formal continuing medical education.
Sounds exciting. Sounds as if, you might actually have something that could be presented as different ways of doing things that might have some really positive, big-term impact. Okay, Abby, are you ready now, or are you still thinking?
Yes, Mark. I have a few thoughts based on what I heard. So hold on, because I was taking some notes here. So one of my questions to us is, if we have a common understanding of the characteristics of your management system or of a successful project in the domain of a complex adaptive system. So for example, when you talked about there are multiple stakeholders, engaging all of the stakeholders who might have a role, asking the questions like, well, what happens to those truck drivers when we replace them with drones? So that would be one. That the experts aren't the ones who are talking to the group, that it's not the managers who are talking, that we include some kind of constructive dialogue, as John was talking about. So one question for me is, could we talk about, because I don't know that we on this call have a shared understanding of the elements of a successful outcome management system or successful complex adaptive system. And then a few things. So I come from the field of leadership and organizational development. And so the models that I wrote down, which to me, somebody said, I think Denise was saying, well, there is no leadership science, or somebody said that. And I kind of scratched my head and I said, really? Isn't there? So the things that I wrote down, which are from my field, which do this kind of stuff, are systems thinking, looking at the entire system, engaging people, multiple stakeholders to look at the system and ask, what are the relationships between these component parts? What are the relationships between the stakeholders? And one key question in systems thinking is, why is it that despite our best efforts, we haven't managed to tackle X ending homelessness, ending income inequality. And what is our role? Each of us has each part of the system, we each have a role in that. What is our role? So systems thinking. Many of you, I think, may be familiar with the Future Search model, which is a 2.5-day model of getting together multiple stakeholders to both look at who are we, what's the community that we're all part of, what's the mind map, what are all the trends that are contributing to this problem, like ending poverty, what are all the trends contributing to that, and then designing some future, what would an ideal future look like and how would we get there? So there's a Future Search model. I was thinking about the model of adaptive leadership. So in terms of a leadership science, to me that's a superb leadership science that separates between the technical and adaptive challenges. And Mark, I heard you say we had a technical solution to some problem at MITRE. I just heard you say the word, so I thought, so where is the thinking about what are the adaptive challenges, which often include a learning element, a need for dialogue among all the parties. We don't know the answer, and we each have a part of the puzzle, so let's have a dialogue to help us understand the problem, and then figure out what the solution is going to be. And I think this fits in complexity science in that the solution is not always obvious. I think you would agree to this. And so in adaptive leadership, you come up with some experiment. So let's do this kind of experiment and see if and how it addresses the challenge. It may address some of it. It may not address any of it, whatever. So we test out this experiment, see if it works, and then we may need to come up with another experiment. So to me, this model fits with complexity science. And then I'd like to speak to John's comments, which I found quite fascinating, because I actually do, I facilitate communities of practice, and I create learning communities and dialogues for people to learn together. So for example, instead of having the experts talk to the group of people assembled, like your physicians, I did something called flipping the classroom, which comes from school education, but I did it within professional development. So we were doing this on best practices in change management, and I had a panel of 3 practitioners. And so I said, rather than having the panel speak to us, let's ask the participants what they want to hear about. What are their questions? What's keeping them up at night? So we gathered their questions, put them all up on the whiteboard, and then I turned to the panelists. I said, panelists, please speak to these questions. So we flipped it. And after they spoke, they got 10 to 15 minutes, and then we turned back to the groups to ask them, okay, so what did you hear? What did what resonated for you? And then I took each panelist and put them in a small group. So we had 3 subgroups with each panelist talking to the people. So it's not just, we're overturning the assumption that the invited experts, like the invited people, are the only experts. No, there's a huge amount of wisdom and experience in the room, and let's kind of figure out a way to integrate those. And lastly, on John's point about social learning, absolutely, because that's what I do in creating these things. So for example, I do this collaborative coaching program in which we bring, we did this at the Boston Medical Center last year. So we brought 7 directors into the room. Each one sat at a table with, let's say, 5 consultants who asked them questions. By the way, we need to teach people how to ask questions, right? That's what your doctors need. Asking questions to help the director get clear about the problem, not to solve the problem. You are not to give advice. You're to ask questions to help the person get clear. And every year that we do this, we get amazing feedback like, that was better than 5 months of therapy. Um, and I'm sorry, I thought of one more thing, again related to John, which is, some of you are familiar with stages of adult development. So, stages of adult development are about, so two key figures on this are Bob Keegan from Harvard, and then Bill Torbert and Bill Joyner. So I can tell you more about this if you want, but what I want to say specifically about the physicians is that they are at the expert model of development, because we turn to physicians to have all the answers, and they think of themselves as the experts. And the key move for them is to realize that there is expertise and wisdom in the field, that they don't know all the answers. In fact, what they need to know are what questions to ask. And so there is distributive wisdom, which they need to learn to call upon. So I've talked a lot. I can, if you want me to say more about adult development, come back to me. I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. Just one question. Do you have real life examples? I think you just started giving some where when we switched from this hierarchical expert culture to a collaborative culture, you saw real sense of progress. You saw people respond differently. You saw more positive outcomes. Do you have examples of that?
Well, I have the example that I told you about the collaborative coaching, for example, at Boston Medical Center. I did a project on ending homelessness. I don't have a full, like the kinds of examples that you may want, which is from the beginning to end, where you started with a problem, engaged people, ended up with a solution. Like I was part of a project on ending homelessness in Northeastern Mass, but I was only part of the beginning. So I don't know that I have full-blown examples, Mark.
We might not be able to get full-blown examples for everything we want to write about or talk about, but there's so many great ideas here that I think people's experiences, I mean, it's storytelling to some degree. Anchor, could you talk a little bit about your experience in this field?
Yeah, sure, Mark. So I get only a bit about complexity science. I came to know that something like this exists only around a year ago, but I think I've learned a bit about it. So let me share how I perceive complexity science is. So I've spent quite a few years, like in the beginning of my career, being a doctor in a small village somewhere in India, and thinking that this whole healthcare business is kind of chaotic. You can't make sense of it. So many people are sick, and you're trying to do something about it. Spending 5-6 years, I realized that this entire healthcare business in India is kind of disorganized, and it needs some, it could use some management, some scientific management. I went ahead, I took some education I did a master's in healthcare management, thinking I will come to know how to fix this. So I was trying to develop some systems thinking and apply it to make healthcare systems better. And once I finished that, I ended up being a consultant to development partners initiative to fix healthcare in a particular district. And while I was trying to do it, I went on to do another work, which was basically building skills on quality improvement among healthcare workers. Now I could realize, I could empathize with them having the same confusion about the system being chaotic. And the administrators, they thought of this as not a chaos, but they thought of this as a complicated issue, which they had solutions to. And they thought that they would give out guidelines to healthcare providers on what they should do. And if healthcare providers did that, it would fix all problems. No newborn who shouldn't die would die, and all mothers will have safe births. So I could see the disconnect very clearly, and I didn't know much what to do about it until sometime later when I realized, it's the way healthcare is being administered, which is a problem. So I think my first understanding about complexity science came from a wonderful comparison about if India can be sending a rocket to Mars successfully, why can't they be fixing their healthcare problem? And that's where I had a discussion with Sonali, who's my colleague and a participant here, and she told me how what's simple, what's complicated, what's complex, and what surely is chaotic. So I think my understanding is that healthcare providers, they think of their systems to be chaotic. It appears chaotic. Walk into any busy. I'm in New Delhi, the capital of this country. Walk into any public hospital, which is free for most of the people. Go there, and it looks like a chaos. It takes quite some experience and quite some understanding to know that what appears chaos is actually a complex adaptive system. There is some system in place. You need to have the eye for it, and you need to also help healthcare providers develop an eye for the slightly imperfect system that they have in place, and develop upon that, make it better, so the desired outcomes are achieved. And I think I can share a small example of a work, if time permits, that I did with a particular hospital in Delhi. So
Yes, please do.
so this was a newborn care unit, and they practice something relatively unheard of in this part of the world, which is doing family centered care. Primarily, they wanted to involve a sick newborn's family into care. So the thinking was that quite a few elements of care can be done by the primary caregiver of a newborn, of the sick newborn, which could be which usually is the mother, could be the father also at times. And they thought by doing this, there would be continuity of care even after this sick newborn becomes healthier and leaves the hospital. So a wonderful thought, but one of the problems they thought is that the intensive care units are very sacrosanct sort of places. A lot of machines and busy staff moving about with the sickest of newborns, and so having a novice parent move in was a big problem in terms of infection control. So they thought, people were not washing their hands properly, and they were very easily they were very easily attributing the blame to people not being educated enough and not caring enough, and we just can't make them understand. So I helped them get together as a team, and we have a very sort of structured method of teaching healthcare providers these quality improvement methods. We get them together, try to talk into them as to what are their chief problems. So this seemed to be their problem. Help them develop a very objective aim. So how are you going to measure how many people wash hands, and how are you going to analyze your problem? Why is this occurring? So I was able to take them through the journey of what does it take to wash your hands. You need to know that washing hands takes away germs from your hands, which could affect your babies. And then you need to have the skills to do it. And then you need to have the wherewithal to wash your hands. And so if you want me washing my hands when I come to see my sick newborn, you have to make it easy for me. The system has to enable washing hands. There have to be least obstructions. Whereas the discourse among healthcare providers usually was that they don't want to be washing hands, which is a very straightforward conclusion, and it isn't so simple always. So we help them untangle this. We help them also So I encouraged them to think over and over. So most of which was talking to these mothers and these fathers who were walking in, because they knew more about themselves than anybody else over there did. So wherein we figured out that they were not washing their hands, and they thought it was not a problem. They thought their hands were clean enough. So so we understood the knowledge gap that was there, and they tried out many different ways of fixing it. And we typically encourage healthcare providers and these improvement teams to uh, bring in a lot of mm, changes, and but try them, test them scientifically over a small period of time and see what works. Because even I, as an improvement coach, do not know what is going to work in a context. So that's what we did, and they were able to improve compliance to hand washing the way it is recommended from around you know uh, around 1/5 of entries, hands would be washed properly, and they moved on to having almost 4 out of 5 times hands being washed properly, and things continuing, and they went long into this. So that's an example of the work I did somewhere. I think as an improvement coach, for me, it's very important to let people not be in despair because they think it's a chaos. Make them believe that there is a system working out there, which you have to understand. But also, on the other hand, especially the administrators who believe that it is a complicated problem, and an executive order or or pasting a protocol on a wall will fix the problem, making them understand that it isn't so straightforward as well. So
This is
yeah.
just a beautiful example of what I'm hoping to get written up about how, the top-down approach is we're going to write an order and we're going to put it on a wall, and when people don't obey it, we're going to fire them or we're going to punish them, and we see where that goes usually, versus engaging people, explaining to them why it's important, having them being part of the solution. So all the things that seems like you were doing to get the compliance rate up to a very high level, the kind of stories that I'm looking for. So
Yeah, sure. I can share the case study. Yeah, we usually will always document it. I have it written already, so
that's
I
great.
can share it. Yeah.
Nolly, do you have something to add? And tell us a little about yourself.
Before Sonali jumps in, just a question. One of the things that just hit me, and it's just amazing, is that what looks immediately to people like chaos can be redefined and made more understandable by saying this is a complex adaptive system. So that's where the concept of being able to educate and let people know that there are reasons why this is happening. So in any large hospital, there's multiple complex adaptive systems constantly interacting with each other and with their outside systems and with the individuals. And yes, it's overwhelming and chaotic. And I do think that that's part of what you were talking about, Mark. Are there ways in which you can scale this? So first you have to scale down before you can scale up. But wow, thank you, Ankar. It's a wonderful example, and there's so much in there that I think would be really valuable to share, and aligns with a lot of the work that had been done at Plexus. But we're looking at it in different ways. The principles are there, we're looking at it different ways. So thank you. Yay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
So Nolly, do you have something to share with us? And tell us a little about yourself. Sonali, are you there? She's probably not there. Well, we'll come back to her if she comes back. So my question is, which of you, first of all, I'm getting a sense that this is a good idea. the idea is still pretty vague, but it's an idea of really starting with people's experiences and what seems to work, and then linking it to the complexity science. That's how I actually learned about this. I actually found things that were working and then read about them in complexity science. And then sometimes they
Hello.
were
Hi, Mark. So, physician, public health.
good. Why don't you tell us a little about yourself and what you're interested in? Sonali, you're muted. There you are.
Yeah. I'm back.
Sonali, you're it's
No, my
not working. Your transmission.
connection dropped off. Oh.
Yeah. Well, if she comes back. So let me get, first of all, do we have a good idea here? And is it something that any one of you would like to participate in? So I'll start with Abby first.
Yes, I'm interested. I'm not clear yet what my role would be, but yes.
Let me share you what I perceive the roles to be, and it may evolve. People will either write a chapter of their experiences, or they'll communicate to one or more of us verbally what they are, and we would write them up and then pass them on to you for editing and changes. And the experience, the way I'm seeing it now, and it could evolve, is that I want people's experiences with working with principles that they feel are part of complexity, without getting into saying, principle 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, but the kind of stories you had about how you flipped the situation with the expert speakers. Okay, we get that kind of thing, and then we go back once we got through these stories and talk about how we're trying to break down an expert culture, how we experimentation, how we involve stakeholders more. We summarize that maybe in a mid-time chapter about how these illustrate principles of complexity. But it sounds like you have some stories that maybe they don't go from A to Z, but they go far enough to say you have experience that this thing is working.
Yes, so yes, and I think that I'm happy to contribute my stories. I think that I can be most valuable in framing either the question or the issues, which is what I was saying earlier. So I'm curious about what do we see as the characteristics of the stories that we're looking at.
Yes.
And Encore's story had some very specific elements, components in it, which might be different from what's in John's story about physician education. So I have an interest in sort of looking at this and asking, okay, what are the different components? What are the elements we're looking at, and how does that fit together? That's where my gift, I think, would come through.
Well, if you can give us a story, but we're going to spend some time in this about looking at all these stories and trying to understand what are the characteristics. That's what I'm getting from this conversation, which it's kind of like we start with the stories. People love to read stories. They don't want to read about, it's exciting to read about my capstone story. But if you start a book out with, here are the 15 principles, you're dead by the time. But you tell stories, and then you get to the end of the stories, as you say, and then we look at what may be the common principles, the kind of things that characterize these stories. Bill, do you have an interest?
Mark, some stories are epic. And my opinion as a positive deviant is that it's deeper complexity. Our complexity is a deeper challenge than what most people realize. And so as someone who works in the healthcare system, I've adapted to the hierarchy in my healthcare organization by keeping my mouth shut. Okay?
That's too bad.
So there is, no, that's the most effective adaptive response.
Right. Yes, it is a very effective response.
Yes, yes. So, but I feel safe talking here. I think that I would be interested in helping you with the book, not necessarily by talking about principles, and not necessarily sharing a story, but possibly talking about the limits of authority in management, and how management often operates like a disembodied brain that doesn't know whether it's up, down, left, or right.
Well, I think you and Abby share maybe the part of the book that brings all these things together at the end. And if you do have stories, great. But because, Prusha, and you have lots of stories that I think you've seen over the years, so maybe you can be helpful in that too.
I have a question. Are you looking for stories about people associated with Plexus having these experiences, or are we looking broader at experiences of people we don't necessarily know whose experiences reflect complexity principles? For instance, I think that the teachers who have tried to develop ways to teach science to kids who come from families where science is rejected, and this is a very common problem now. There have been several stories about it. What they've done does, even though they don't use the language, it does involve complexity principles. They've taken kids out in the woods, kids who are used to being in nature, and show them exactly what, there are less fish here, there's less grass here, use examples in nature that they can actually see and touch. It's not totally successful. Some kids so reject it, but some kids do begin to accept some science. And there are a number of examples of that. There's also, in the Gates Project, there was a music teacher who did some fabulous work using complexity principles. We've never interviewed him individually. It was sort of a political thing at the time, but so much time has elapsed. We might be able to approach that. But I didn't know whether what are the boundaries for the stories you're looking at?
I'm looking, you see, almost on every day in the news, I'll hear some amazing story about somebody in Detroit who's doing so. There are thousands of these stories.
Right.
I would like to start with the Plexus community, because I would like to build the book around Plexus community. Now, for me, that means either stories that you personally have been part of, or people that in your work. I'm hoping we have enough examples of, I know in healthcare we have lots of examples of how this works. But if I broaden it right to every story in the world, now what we could do is we might have a chapter on things that go outside of us, but we can examine that to see how rich our stories are. But for me, when you experience something, you can tell it in a richer way than if I go to, or if I'm interacting with somebody and interviewing them, like this teacher. I feel like I understand it better than I'm reading an article or watching something on the PBS News.
Oh yeah, well, I'd be talking about interviews if you were going,
Yeah, interviews would be fine with people that we have engaged or somehow. So that's where I'm. So, Prusha, you've indicated you're interested, and I'm delighted to have you on the team with us because I'm excited by. I think this is something that also helps put Plexus on the map, which is that we've been talking about building products that we can get people to know us about, and if we had something like this, I think it would be a Plexus-centric thing. John, do you have any interest in this project?
Well, I would say right away, Mark, yes, I do. But whether or not I could be helpful, my area, which, I'm very focused on, is looking at where continuing education is stuck, so to speak, and where a better understanding of complexity science would help us to get out of these.
John, you already provided us information. At least I feel that way. I don't know how other people. You already provided some stories and experiences that seem to be relevant to this kind of topic. So
I'd be happy to enlarge on these stories a bit. I see stories having several functions. Probably the most important in my arena is stories that actually build relationships. So when I do help groups to start meetings with stories, for instance, one of the major problems that come back is that people don't stop and discuss the story enough. They go on to the next story.
right.
So after 15 minutes, oh, well, we've had lots of stories now, because, and basically what they're doing is saying we all have similar stories with this. But to actually understand the depth needs a level of interaction that's not often there. So maybe after the story in your book or text or whatever it is, there needs to be a discussion amongst the group if we want to walk the talk.
Yes.
Of complexity science.
Yes.
There may be a story followed by a discussion because it sounds very much like we all come from different perspectives, and that would create a very rich discussion about a story. And one of the things, if I could just finish that by saying, there is a program where people bring their I forget the name of it now, bring their articles, from something that's 200 years old, and they bring it to the program. You'll know the name of it. And what's more interesting is not what the program is, but actually how they acquired it.
Oh, it's called Antique Roadshow.
Antique Roadshow, exactly.
Yeah.
And the story behind the object is far more interesting than the object itself. And so I would say that maybe if there was a pattern whereby a story was told, and then the group of authors, if you want to call it, actually discuss that and discuss the applications of this in complexity science, or the implications. And I think that would make a rich text of some sort.
I think so too. I can see a three-tier thing where we tell the story, we look at that story about what we thought was significant in terms of complexity theory, and then the final chapter after all the stories go through are, so what are the commonalities among them all? That just feels really good.
Yeah.
Ankur, it sounds like you'd be willing to share at least your experiences.
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to. I have already documented most of these stories of our work. I'll be happy to share that. And I think another contribution I can make is once this compilation of stories is built up, and at the end of it, as John said, you explain what's the complexity science, and there as a beginner who's just trying to understand complexity science, I can give you my perspective on how it helps me, how much it helps me understand or not. So that's what I could add.
Wow, good. Okay.
I have a question for Ankur.
Sonali, I don't know if you can hear us.
Yes, please.
Ankur?
Yeah, Ankur, you wrote up the case study about this example of the hospital in Delhi. Was it for was the overall topic dealing in complex adaptive systems, or was there a different framing for it?
No, it was a story of how health providers can use improvement science to fix healthcare delivery issues, and the primary audience was other healthcare providers who can learn from that.
So I find that fascinating because there's actually a definition out there about improvement science. In other words, the the context, the framework is improvement science. And there's quite an interesting list of characteristics about what improvement science is.
Well, yeah, that's it. It would have all those characteristics of improvement
Right.
science. Yeah.
Right. I'm just connecting that again to the question about what is it that we're looking at to help us define it.
So what I'm hearing is that I think everybody here is willing to at least be part of this project, which is very encouraging. What I'd like to do is get you all on a list, and I've written a first chapter. So I'll send you out something that just tells you this is how my story went, okay? And that's what we've done. I think in December we'll let it be the holiday season, but in January I'm going to start this thing up in a pretty significant way. So you'll all be hearing from me, and we'll be moving forward. I find this, I don't know how you all, but I found this very exciting and encouraging.
And one of the things that I think is really cool is this group is here, and I'm going to, if it's all okay with everybody, I'm going to share this recording with the broader Plexus community, and we'll see if there are other people who are interested in, in participating. And it's really, really amazing to me each time we get together that we're all willing to give of what we know and share and teach out and then take back in. And there's some really valuable opportunities here for everybody. And I just think this is really incredible. Thank you, Mark, for starting, and for everyone else being here. So I'm going to just mute myself and turn it back over to Mark.
Yes. So again, thank you all. After the new year, we'll be in touch. Denise, could you make sure that you send me the emails, and then I can start a list of people that will be part of this project. And it'd be nice to, make this like a year project, but we'll see how it goes. We're going to learn a lot as we go. Thank you all. I mean, I learned so much from this. Talk about complexity theory. My ideas have shifted and evolved just in having this 1 hour conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Denise, we'll talk on Tuesday.
And please share your email. I think everyone has. Please feel free to share that. So I'm going to stop the recording now.